Lee McKenzie, Scottish broadcaster, on the line. Morning, Lee. How are things?
Morning. I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Keeping well, keeping well. I've been busy reading this book for anyone unfamiliar. Inside F1, your journey and your I guess it tells a story through 7 different drivers across the years, and how they've impacted your life and how their careers have impacted the lives of Formula One fans as well. Like your own interest in Formula One, and this is something I hadn't realised when I was reading the introduction to the book, stemmed very, very much so from your dad.
Yeah, it's I was the sort of annoying child that turned up absolutely everywhere. I had covered an awful lot of rugby. I had attended athletics, Formula One, everything really by about the age of, I don't know, 13, 14, 15. And then you just sort of look around one day and you think, I wonder if I could earn money by still coming to sport and pretending it's a proper job. And really that's what I've done since.
Like when you're watching Formula One races on TV and you reference the Ayrton Senna, Roland Ratzenberger tragedy at Imola in 1994, like did moments like that wake you up to the dangers of the sport and covering those dangers to a greater degree? It must have been quite a turning point to watch that on television, for example. Yeah,
I mean, I was too young to be going to the sport then, but it did make you suddenly sit up and think, okay, this is a sport with consequences, because, you know, my background was all horses, and I knew if I fell off, you know, you'd be sore, you could be injured, you could break your arm, whatever. It could be much worse, but I don't think as a kid that you really appreciate that. The other sports, you know, you see people limping off in rugby and things. When I was that age, again, I didn't maybe realise the consequences. But somebody crashing into a safety barrier had huge consequences. But it bizarrely didn't put me off. It just sort of made me understand it a lot earlier than a lot of people would have, possibly.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective and the dangers of the sport, for sure. Like for anyone who was interested in the book, so David Coulthard writes the foreword, and then you've got a chapter on 7, all individually fascinating drivers. So Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, Max Verstappen, Fernando Alonso, Felipe Massa, and Jenson Button. All interesting characters. Like we might maybe start on Michael Schumacher, because I know you have a deep interest in plenty of sports, but equestrian sports might be right up there. And yourself and Michael, that's something that you both shared, and that there's a really, really fascinating anecdote you touch on in the book where you end up on Michael's ranch, essentially.
Yeah, we used to talk about a lot of sports. I love it when you meet different athletes that you can talk of sort of a wide variety of sports. And Michael was one of those people. A lot of people, you know, most people wouldn't appreciate that. But his family had the huge ranch, and actually they still do, and in Texas as well. But their love of equestrian was Western riding. So reining, the sort of Stetsons, the chaps, the sliding, and it's not something that we particularly do in the UK, certainly. But he gave me a challenge to compete at the European Championships against him. So I took a horse from West Sussex. I had no idea about Western riding, and I still don't, to be fair. And I took this horse from West Sussex over to Switzerland and competed against him. And we did an interview, and it was great fun. But yeah, I did stand on the same step of the podium as Michael, albeit wearing a Stetson and chaps. And yeah, it was very, very surreal.
That's one for the grandkids. Stand on the same podium as Michael Schumacher. Interestingly, Lee, we had an Irish basketball commentator, Timmy McCarthy, on the show recently, where he was talking about his first time meeting Michael Jordan and interviewing Michael Jordan and the imprint that left on him. Like for you, that first time that you got to interview Michael Schumacher face to face must be quite a nerve-wracking moment, but then you're a professional as well, so you're also trying to get the questions right. Like what type of interviewee was he?
You had to be really sharp. You had to know what you were doing. You had to get your prep in order, because Michael was the sort of master of turning it back on you. And maybe a bit like a politician, he would just sort of talk at you and change the rhetoric to exactly what he wanted. But then it was my duty to try and navigate him back to, yeah, well, that's all very well. You might have been fastest in lap 23, but you weren't on 24, 25, 20. And it was just sort of like doing it with the respect, but also letting him know that I knew what he was up to. And it was interesting, like, writing this, because I went back through so many old interviews for each driver. And the ones with Michael, I was actually really quite firm in the interview with him, much more than I ever remembered. I was kind of watching them back going, oh my gosh, I can't believe I asked that. But it was great. And it was nice to see the rapport again, because you forget things so quickly. Formula One is such a fast-moving sport in every sense that it moves on. You maybe do four interviews a week with these guys. So you're not going to remember everything, but doing the book, it's kind of like really jogged my memory.
And you touch on it in the book as well, that he clearly is someone who transcended the sport, and we remember certain moments from his career, and one of them that stood out for me, and jogged my memory on it as well, was the 1998 Spa Grand Prix in Belgium, where the famous / infamous incident with David Coulthard and running down the pit lane towards him. That must have been quite a race to cover, given the it's one that we still talk about so many years later.
Yeah, that was probably, I was there on work experience. I was still at university at the time. In fact, I was probably I think I just started university, but I was doing work experience. So that was the first one that I went to in a sort of proper role. And I still presented the Belgian Grand Prix a few weeks ago for Channel 4. And there is no Belgian Grand Prix that goes past that we don't use the footage of DC causing absolute chaos and Michael trying to like run down and punch him, because I obviously present the programme with David. So if there's ever an opportunity to show the absolute chaos that he caused, we'll always bring out that footage.
We might move on to Lewis Hamilton, because there's a great chapter on Lewis as well, and the type of character he is, and how he's changed over the years as well. Maybe mellowed to some degree, as drivers tend to do it towards the end of their careers. You referenced, and there was a great thing, a quote from the book, where you said, during an interview with Lewis, he talked about, when I went for my first signing for McLaren, I remember Ron Dennis looking me up and down because I had baggy jeans, didn't necessarily have the smartest of outfits on. My dad always told me, you've got to look the part. And that was really interesting, that when he started off with McLaren, he went from this kid with the braids and dressing the way he dresses now, to be fair, to this prim and proper young kid who wanted that place on the grid.
Yeah, I mean, I think how he's dressing now is like completely exacerbated. Every day is like a fashion parade. The camera's just set up now for every time Lewis enters the paddock, because what he wears will make global news, which is just really bizarre. You don't get that, when I'm standing freezing doing Champions Cup at the RDS or something, I'm not exactly waiting for a Johnny or someone to come strutting in like some like major fashion statement. But Formula One, you get a bit of that as well. But Lewis, I think, is actually closer to the person he was when he was 17, 18, 19.
Sorry, we just
at this stage.
Just struggling with your line there, Lee. We're going to get you back in 1 second. Just 1 second. Just a bit of a choppy one. Bit like the F1 paddock, trying to interview people on the
good analogy.
Nice segue.
It's a bit like when Bowie goes on and our tennis segments tend to go through the roof. I have a feeling that Formula One might be making F1 fans out there.
It's probably, I think it's when you see Martin Brundle before the Formula One races doing the pit lane walks and interviewing, and it's absolute carnage. You've got the celebrities, you've got the drivers, and you've got the teams trying to get the last minute preparations together. So there's that mix between the ridiculous and the celebrities trying to get their little photo ops and words in with the drivers, and then these people in a multi-million-dollar industry trying to get the preparations done on their car, the last minute bits and bobs, drivers listening to music or getting their last minute preparations in. It's one of the great things in sport, I think, is watching Martin Brundle do what he does.
It's quality, and it's so unique as well, because how do you get that sort of access to be up close? And not necessarily, he does obviously harangue drivers every now and then, but not necessarily. It'd be like walking around the tunnel before a football match and just grabbing people all over the place. Yeah,
but Lee does it brilliantly as well, where you're with Formula One drivers especially. I know most top sports people have egos, but I think Formula One drivers particularly have a certain sense of entitlement and ego, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think you're allowed to, when you're at the top of your game. And I mentioned it to Jerry yesterday. Like, I was down with Alex Dunn, the young Formula 4 driver from Clonbelogan Offaly. He gave me a few spins around Mondello Park last week, and he's only 16, but there is a cockiness to him as well that I really liked. Because I was going down there thinking, he's going to be a meek little 16-year-old. He doesn't even have his driving licence, but he's driving in Formula 4. But he had there was a little edge about him. And I think when you're getting behind the wheel of a very fast motor car, you kind of have to have the edge about you. So for people like Lee to navigate these interviews with egos like Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen and Massa and Schumacher, like, there's not one of them not touched by ego.
Oh yeah, I mean it's one of the most egotistical. Is that fair enough? Sports, you would think, and also it's just at that elite level. Like I mean, when you consider the number of, even though the Premier League is like the elite of the elite, it's, you look at the number of players, right? There's hundreds of them in the Premier League, and in Formula One you have whatever. What is it?
It's 20 drivers on the grid.
20.
And like so, and you think of all the drivers just beyond that 20 who are trying to get their seat on the grid as well. Not an easy thing to do, but yeah, I'd be really just. It's a job that I'd love to get down to the paddock at some stage and interview some drivers there. That's the dream. That's up there with my covering space launches. Adrian is my
right.
Not that this isn't.
I think
job.
one is more easily achievable than the other. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know how you're going to get into the paddock to do some interviews.
It's tough. We have Lee McKenzie back on the line. Lee, we're just talking there about the madness of the paddock interviews and like people like yourself and Martin Brundle have to do these interviews where you've got the mania of celebrities trying to get their little moments with the drivers, but then you've got, as I say, a multi-million-dollar industry of teams running around and drivers trying to prepare. It must be quite a manic environment, and you touch on it very well in the book as well.
Yeah, I think if you use Miami as the example, which was quite a famous one with Martin earlier on this year, Miami we just called rather disparagingly the Instagram Grand Prix because it was madness. You know, there was like anyone who lived within a sort of 2,000-mile vicinity of Miami turned up on the grid on that day. And it was just, you couldn't do your job. I mean, that's what it came down to. You just actually couldn't do your job. The drivers were getting really annoyed because they were just in some sort of media frenzy, celeb frenzy. And ultimately, they have a job to do literally 5 minutes later. They love it when we all get off the grid. They can put their visor down, sit in the car and just get to work because anything before that is just a distraction. And it does really amaze me that we get as close as we do to the drivers literally just before they're going to, you know, sit there and tear off at like 200 kilometers an hour. I think it's just, I hope it lasts. I'm not sure how long it will last, but I really hope it does because that's something which is so different about Formula One. One
of the great stories you also touched on in the book was the manic nature of the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, when we had that Hamilton versus Massa battle down to essentially the last corners of the championship title race, when Hamilton ultimately came out on top, and the local Brazilian crowd devastated, no doubt, that their man Felipe Massa didn't get over the line. But that must have been quite interesting because even you touch in the book about, you know, driving through the favelas and reasonably dangerous neighbourhoods around that race as well. So that entire experience between getting to Brazil and driving through those neighbourhoods and then to have the race end and the championship end in the way it did must have been an eye-opening experience.
Yeah, and that was actually my first one for BBC. I just wanted to go do a good job. There'd been an incident on a Thursday that we'd had a gun put in through our window. So it actually turned out quite a funny story, but I won't ruin it for people who are reading the book. But yeah, we had a gun put in through the window, and then so everybody was already in a heightened state, and it was David Coulthard's last race. So that was a big story in terms of the UK. Would Lewis Hamilton become, you know, get his first world title? And then you just got to that Sunday where the rain was falling. Brazil always has a very different aura anyway. If you sort of believe that stadiums or places like that, you can get a different feel. That is certainly somewhere. And just how the race played out. And that to me is still one of the sort of most chilling or a moment that sums up exactly what sport is. On paper, there was a winner and a loser, but actually there was so much more than that. It was devastation for Felipe Massa, and it was everything that Lewis Hamilton had ever dreamed of. And the fact that Felipe thought it was his family thought it was his, they'd achieved that dream, and then for it to be not taken away from him, because in actual fact, he hadn't won it. He'd never won it. But yeah, it will stay with me for the rest of my life.
As an interviewer, Lee, you'd have noticed this as well, and we get it quite often where sports people want to talk about other things and almost their face lights up when they get to touch on topics other than their chosen sport, like Brian O'Driscoll on golf maybe is a good example. Yes. And even myself, when the couple of times I've met Ronnie O'Sullivan, regardless of talking about snooker, he loves talking about athletics and running and getting out on the on the track or on the roads. For you, there was a great anecdote in the book as well where you're talking to Lewis Hamilton, and he brings up I wouldn't say an acting debut, but he had a small, not part to play, but Ridley Scott gave him an opportunity to get on set one day.
Yeah, that was surreal. I mean, I do these end of season interviews that really, when you go in that nobody wants to be there, because maybe the guy who's won the championship wants to be there, but you sort of sit down and you're really enthusiastic. You've done all your prep and you're like, so pre-season testing, February. And they're like, February? I don't even remember last week. And you go through the year, and they're quite dull, these interviews. But Lewis just suddenly came out with the fact that in Hungary, he didn't say he lost the race because of it, but essentially he did. He'd been asked to go on to set for the Martian and sit in the chair and sort of like play the part. And when Matt Damon didn't turn up, Lewis was going to take that part for the morning and all the rest of it. And he basically burnt himself out. And he was exhausted, and he drove like he was exhausted. He doesn't make many mistakes as a driver. He created chaos in that race. And it was just a bizarre interview. And then at the end, he said to me, "Oh man, I shouldn't have said that to you. That should have been in my book." And I was like, I'm not sure if it should be in anyone's book, to be honest. But yeah, most drivers get up in the morning, have breakfast, get to the track, headphones on, head down. Whereas Lewis actually has the capacity, maybe not on that day, but he has a capacity for so much more. In Singapore, he took his DJ suite with him, and he's making his music at 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And admittedly, we stay on European time, but most drivers only focus on the driving, whereas Lewis has always had a lot more time for other stuff.
Finally, Lee, and look for other stories from other drivers, and Sebastian Vettel is one that I really love from the book as well. Such a fascinating character, but people can listen or read to all the different stories with all those 7 drivers in the book. But if you had to put your nail in the mast and pick your best Formula One driver of all time, let's say. I know Juan Manuel Fangio from the 50s comes up in a lot of people's conversations, but even in a recent sense, do you have a favourite? I'm sure you're asked the question quite often.
Yeah, and I was actually talking about this to Sir Jackie Stewart, a 3-time world champion, who I've known since I was a kid. We were talking about this recently. Can you compare like for like in terms of, the sport has changed so much. The cars have changed even in the last 10 years. It's really difficult to know. Michael had his faults, a lot of people said. I thought he was a sublime driver. I think that actually somebody who goes without a lot of recognition is Fernando Alonso, because he's just a 2-time world champion, but for many years he's dragged these underperforming cars around tracks. He's 8 points away from being a 5-time world champion, and through whether it be decisions, moving teams at the wrong time, he could have achieved so much more. But I think actually he's an exceptional driver, Fernando.
Lee, great stuff as always. Where can people get the book? It's Black and White Publishing. Inside F1 is the name of the book, but all good bookstores, is it?
All good bookstores, apparently even supermarkets. So the next time that you've struggling to afford bread and butter and all the basics, just forget the food and go straight to the book stands.
Great stuff. Lee McKenzie, thanks a million for joining us as always.
Thank you.
F1 broadcaster, and definitely give the book a read. It's a great insight into some of the Formula One stories over the years. It's a fascinating sport.
Lewis Hamilton in The Martian seems like a pretty coming together of, like, if Shane Hannon was to design a movie.
Yeah. Lewis Hamilton or Matt Damon. I don't know who they should have picked there, but maybe he has a career in acting after he hangs up the, what do you say? Hangs up the gloves, hangs up the wheel. Doesn't hang up a car, but he's one of those characters that I think will go into different things after his career is over.